After studying this module, you shall be able to know about the meaning of torture, the type of custody as applicable in Indian circumstances, the scenario of death during police actions, the methods of various custodial torture, and the medico-legal aspects associated with custodial torture. I will begin with a quote from Adrian Barto about the custodial torture. Torture is a wound in the soul so painful that sometimes you can almost touch it, but it is also so intangible that there is no way to heal it. Torture is anguish squeezing in your chest, cold as ice and heavy as a stone, paralyzing as sleep and dark as the abyss. Torture is despair and fear and rage and hate. It's a desire to kill and destroy, including yourself. Custodial torture, the present status. The World Medical Association, in its Tokyo Declaration in year 1975, they defined torture as the deliberate, systematic or wanton infliction of physical or mental suffering by one or more persons acting alone or on the orders of any authority to force another person to yield some information, to make a confession, or for any other reason. Custodial torture, often known as extrajudicial execution, that has been rise in our country between the year 2002 and 7. As per the report of Asian Center for Human Rights, the nationwide figures are 4 custodial deaths per day. There have been 7,468 custodial deaths during this 5-year period of 2002 to 2007. However, the severity of the torture in India is far worse what the statistics suggest. This is because victims rarely report cases against the police due to fear of reprisals. More than half the cases of custodial torture are not even reported. The explanations for torture can be broadly discussed under categories such as role of media, colonial origins, and institutional weaknesses. To understand all these, firstly, there is a strong sense that the media exaggerates the incidents of torture and creates a negative image of the police. Secondly, the scholars contend that the current police still suffer from the impact of their colonial origins as a respective instrument of the police Raj, or what we call as Inspector Raj. As a result, the police mindset is steeped into this colonial era when the police were supposed to treat every Indian as an enemy of the state. Thirdly, there is a constant pressure on the police from all quarters, including politicians, bureaucrats, to show instant results. The lack of adequate facilities and personnel for the investigation and the extremely high caseload with an inefficient supervisory structure, this hinders the ability of the police to produce the results required of them, prompting them to take shortcuts. In addition, the lack of training in human rights is considered a primary reason why third-degree torture continues to exist in India. Violence is used widely with impunity especially in the northern eastern states. The state of Manipur, if I talk about the scenario in India, the state of Manipur in particular is completely militarized. The paramilitary and the army detachments stationed in that state is notorious for the use of torture and violence as the only tool for investigation. Cases reported from Manipur are mostly involving the armed forces, the Assam Rifles in particular, as has been collected through various literatures. The administrative neglect prompting the use of torture is misused by the police and other law enforcement agencies as an excuse for demanding bribe and for not doing their job according to the law. This continuing neglect by the government has also considerably reduced the morale of all the law enforcing agencies. So rather than being considered as an essential state service police and other law enforcement agencies, they are viewed as state sponsored terror agents, mostly filled with criminals. With this background, we will try to understand what are the various types of custody or the various situations when this term custody is used. Literally, the word custody means the protective care or guardianship of someone or something. That's the literal meaning of the word custody. Arrest, that is almost synonymous with the custody. First the person is arrested, afterwards taken into custody. Arrest means taking, seizing or detaining of the person of another either by touching or putting hands on him or by any act which indicates an intention to take him into the custody and subjects the person arrested to the actual control and will of the person making the arrest. In other words, it can be labeled as to deprive a person of liberty by taking him into custody, especially under lawful authority, usually in response to a criminal charge. Then what is police custody? Police custody does not always means proper arrest, as it includes restriction on the movement of the person concerned. Then the word detention. Detention is the process when a state government or citizen lawfully holds a person by removing their freedom of liberty at that point of time. This can be due to any pending criminal charge being raised against the individual as part of a prosecution or to protect a person or property. Being detained does not always result in being taken to a particular area, what we called as a detention center, either for interrogation or as a punishment for a crime. Then word imprisonment or incarceration. It is the detention of a person in prison, normally as punishment for a wrongdoing. Basically, you can say it's a custodial sentence. So the purpose of it is to use it as a state tool for punishment and also as a means to deter general public against breaching the rule of law. And during this period, prisoners are also rehabilitated. Now let's understand how a person dies during a normal police action. There are few situations, few scientific situations, so I'll try to delve a little bit deeper into those aspects. First and foremost is the carotid sleeper. As you know, this is the portion where this carotid body is situated, where the artery which is supplying blood to the brain, that bifurcates from here, and here there is a portion of that artery that is called as carotid body. So that is the location of carotid body. The carotid sleeper is designed to compress the common carotid arteries, and this produces transient cerebral ischemia. That means it hampers the supply of the brain temporarily. Another aspect involved is it results in the carotid sinus stimulation, because as we know that carotid body, they have got a lot of supply from the vagus nerves, and the vagus nerves is directly connected to the heart as well. So when this is stimulated, this results in a massive stimulation of the carotid sinus, and this in turn leads to the bradycardia at the time of, and many a times it precipitates the cardiac arrest. So once the person is weakened, the complete recovery is expected. So that is infrequently, or you can say very frequently, used by the police, just making the person holding from his neck. Then there is a choke hold. This exercise is designed to occlude the airway by the forearm compression of the front of neck. This is similar to the earlier maneuvers only that the pressure is directly applied to the airway. The fatal consequences of the neck holds can be due to pre-existing natural diseases like any of the heart disease, what we call as coronary artery disease, or the cardiac arrhythmia, or the atherosclerosis, and this multiplies the risk. To further complicate the matter, subjects might be under the influence of alcohol, under the influence of any narcotic and psychotropic drugs, which further increases the chances of arrhythmias. Thus, it is imperative that such deaths have to be transparently investigated, not only to determine the cause of death, but also to instill public confidence in this institution of police. Now, coming on to the word torture, how it has been defined to be precise. Torture can be simply described as the act to inflict intense physical, psychological, emotional pain in order to punish, coerce, or afford sadistic pleasure, and as the United Nations Convention Against Torture 1984 defines the torture as any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as obtaining from him or a third person information or a confession, punishing him for an act he or a third person has committed or is suspected of having committed, or intimidating or coercing him or a third person, or for any reason based upon the discrimination of any kind, when such pain or suffering is inflicted by, or at the instigation of, or with the consent or acquiescence of a public official or other persons acting in an official capacity. It does not include pain or suffering arising only from inherent in or incidental to lawful sanctions. So, it is a pretty broad definition. Now, we will go further deeper into what are the various common practices of custodial torture which are being practiced and how we can investigate, that is the medico legal aspects related with those. We can classify various methods of torture in basically the four categories, that is the physical torture, the sexual torture, the psychological torture, and the pharmacological torture. So, these are the basically four types of torture. Now, taking one by one. First, the physical torture. The severity, extent, and appearance of injuries depend on the various factors like age of the person, sex of the person, presence or absence of clothing, the build of the person and the nourishment, whether it's a poorly built or massively built or how nourished he is, presence of any pre-existing illness, type of the offending object, the force of impact, the number and duration of each session of beatings, and the time interval between the session of beatings and time interval between the torture and the examination. Some of the torture maneuvers I will be describing in much detail. These are not exhaustive, but they will help in understanding the concept of torture medicine. The first and foremost or the commonest is the repeated beatings under the physical torture. Severe forms of blunt trauma including beatings on the back and buttocks, that is the commonest form. It is common practice to repeatedly hit on the back of the person with any blunt object like sticks and lathis. When such person is examined by a doctor on external examination, there may be presence of a very small abrasion, contusion or lacerations. But the presence of fracture can be detected and confirmed only by the radiological investigations. So, it is suggested that in all such cases there the person must be subjected for at least an X-ray examination because they may not be visible to the naked eyes. Then second common is the beating on the soles of the feet. And there is a term which has been used frequently, you can say in the during the police conversations, that is called as phalanga. That is not a scientific term, but that is the term which is very frequently used when we talk about torture in India. In other part of the world, that is called as bastinado, that is foot whipping, and this is a process in which both soles of the feet are repeatedly beaten with any blunt object like lathis, baton sticks, rods, etc. Usually the victim is immobilized before this act, so he is made stand still, or you can say he cannot move. The physical findings vary from case to case and change over the period of time. The immediate signs and symptoms include swelling of this foot associated with severe pain. At times, it is associated with extravasation of blood and hematoma leading to discoloration of foot. Fracture of tarsals, metatarsals and phalanges, that means the bones of the sole, they can be present, and the same can be documented and confirmed only after X-ray examination. In a chronic case, or if this method has been used for a period of time, there will be loss of soft tissues in the heels, and because of that severe pain, the walking is impaired, the person is unable to walk normally. And typically the torture victim is only able to walk a very limited distance, after which he will be overwhelmed by the excruciating pain, which will be only relieved by taking rest. So he will move to a certain steps, 10 steps or so, and then after he will take rest and then further proceed. The third form of a physical abuse or physical torture is the prolonged handcuffing, restraint and shackling. The true reason for subjecting the detainees to these procedures is basically to prevent them from escaping, but often they have been used as a means of punishment, humiliation, coercion and even to extort bribe. Nonetheless, globally restraint and shackling are used on the detainees. The use of leg irons is widespread in Pakistan, our neighboring country. The prolonged shackling and restraint use was allegedly used by the US military in its Guantanamo Bay detention camp is a detainment and interrogation facility. In China, many euphemisms are given to shackling to morph the agonizing nature of the process. Then fourth one is the positional torture. Many forms of positional torture are practiced around the world. Characteristically, the victim is tied in unnatural positions which cause severe discomfort and pain. A small compact cell dubbed as the refrigerator is used to keep the victim immobile for hours or maybe days. Depending upon the type of position and the duration, injuries to soft tissues to the body may be produced which are difficult to recognize even after radiological examination. That means even after subjecting the person for X-rays, because they are not limited, they are not confined to bones, they are not affected the bones. Then the suspension for long hours, that is another method of physical torture. Suspension of the victim by a rope tied to the roof ceiling is a common form of torture that can result in immense discomfort and pain with very little visible external injury. They are not visible to the naked eyes. Different types include crossed suspension, the butchery suspension, the reverse butchery suspension, the flexed forward suspension, the Palestinian suspension, the parrot perch suspension, and so on. Depending upon the type and duration characteristics, the brachial plexus injuries can lead to the paralysis of the arm involving the segments of upper limbs. While conducting clinical examination of such victims, along with the external examination, one has to also look for any peripheral neurological deficits, because that is the small sign which will say that the person has been subjected to this kind of torture, because that will not leave any physical mark. Then sixth category is the crushing injuries. At times, the victims are made to spread their hands on the floor only to be stamped repeatedly by the torturer with heavy leather boots, and this leads to fracture of the carpal bones, metacarpal and phalangeal bones. These are small bones of the hand. The another type of crushing which was practiced in Punjab, especially during the period of terrorist control during the 1980s and 1990s. This practice is called ghotna. The most common method is with the victim seated or lying on the back, and a ghotna is again a local term. Basically, it represents a wooden pole used to pound spices and grains. That is called as ghotna. And this ghotna was to be rolled up and down the front of the thighs with one or more individuals standing on it. Occasionally, with the victim prone, it is rolled over the hips till the calf, avoiding the bony areas. The direct effects are extensive bruising and inability to walk, and even years later there is usually pain on walking far. So the person is unable to walk up to a distance. On examination, there may be scarring on the bony points with noticeable tenderness on the thigh muscles. Then another category of physical torture is abnormal stretching. In the local language in the North Indian states, especially in the state of Punjab, it is called as chira lagana, chira. So this is the tearing is the pet name given for this particular maneuver, chira lagana. The victim is seated on the floor, often with one torturer supporting him from behind and two others forcefully stretching the legs, causing extensive hematomas in the groin region. Sometimes the pelvic girdle is injured, and rarely femur can also be fractured. At times, this is accompanied by repeated kicking of the external genitalia, adding further insult and injury. The victim usually develops a very long-term disability and can never walk or stand in a normal way. Then, another category, that is burning or scalding. In this particular category, the cigarette burns are one of the commonest, or maybe burns with instruments is also practiced around the world, all over the globe. If the cigarette is deliberately stubbed out and held immobile on the skin, the scar is often characteristically circular, about 1 centimeter in diameter, with a hyperpigmented periphery and an atrophic hypopigmented tissue paper center. The acid burns may leave a trail indicating the victim's posture. Scarring tends to be more elaborate and in some cases may lead to keloid formation. The heated metal objects often leave scars of distinctive shape of the offending objects on the body of the person. Then comes the electric shocks. The electric shocks have also been used very frequently because they cause immense pain but does not leave any identifiable physical signs. They rarely leave that. Usually the most sensitive areas like genitals and breasts, they are the target organs, and the victim is humiliated and serious bodily injury is threatened. Sometimes an electrode is inserted in the anus, which may lead to uncontrolled urination and defecation accompanied by the terrible pain and hopelessness. Sometimes the electrodes can leave the small burn injury, but after some time it may lead to a small hyperpigmented patch. If the person is examined, there will not have any of, you can say, the physical findings. It's very inconclusive, but it has got a corroborative value as per the allegation of the victim. Then comes the prolonged exposure to hot or cold temperatures. That is also a form of physical torture. Sometimes the victims are subjected to prolonged exposure to either hot or cold temperatures. In hot climatic places like deserts, they may be tied under direct sunlight, needless to say without food or water. Then this causes various effects like exhaustion and heat stroke. And in cold places, they may be exposed to sub-zero temperatures without cloths, leading to variety of conditions like chilblains, frostbite, trench foot, and in extreme cases maybe hypothermic shock as well. Then trauma to the eyes. Repeated punches to the face over the orbit. This can cause serious damage to the orbital complex. The spectrum of damage sustained may range from a simple contusion around the periorbital region to serious injuries like retinal hemorrhage, dislocation or subluxation of the ocular lens, or even the detachment of retina. Sometimes the chili powder or some other irritant may be smeared to the eyes. In China, sometimes the police officials use tiger balm, what they call as tiger balm. Basically, it's a powerful analgesic ointment causing serious damage to the eyes. Trauma to the ears. The word is, or you can say the slang which is used for describing this trauma to the ear is telephono, and this is used to describe hard slappings to the ear. Usually it leads to the rupture of the tympanic membrane inside, and sometimes it may lead to serious damage to the middle ears, ossicles, or even the inner ear as well. So now we are coming on to the second category of the torture, second methods of torture after finishing with the physical torture. Now coming on to the sexual torture. It usually begins with forced nudity, making the victims helpless, enhancing the psychological horror of the impending torture. This is usually accompanied by verbal abuse, mock execution, and threats which will only add to the mental anguish. At times it is just a symbolic ritual. There may be constant verbal threat of inflicting the victim with HIV, that means human immunodeficiency virus infections, as well as sexually transmitted diseases. And in case of females, the threat of becoming pregnant adds to the anguish. In women, there may be mutilation of the breast and the genitalia, and in men, there may be hematoma in the testicles due to repeated squeezings. Sometimes a smooth lathi, that is a stick, wooden stick, is lubricated with oil and smeared with the chili powder and then inserted into anus, causing unimaginable pain and suffering. Then coming on to the third category of torture, that is psychological torture. These maneuvers, apart from causing physical pains, are intended to inflict greater psychological harm to the victim. There can be many methods for psychological torture. The first and foremost is the prolonged sleep deprivation. What it causes? It leads to severe psychological consequences. There are significant cognitive impairments, and this includes deficit in memory, the reasoning, the learning, the decision-making capacity, all are affected. The UN Committee Against Torture has noted that sleep deprivation for prolonged duration constitutes torture. Sexual humiliation, that is also a form of psychological torture. Here, the victims may be forced to perform humiliating acts like prolonged nudity, human nude pyramid, performing sexual exercises with animals, forced sexual encounters between brother and sister, often exploiting cultural and religious sensitiveness, leading to enormous shame, guilt and worthlessness. And as I told earlier, mock execution. A mock or sham execution is a trick which is deliberately played by the torturer. Here the victim or maybe victims, many victims may be blindfolded, transported to a remote place, made to dig their grave, followed by holding a gun to their head and pulling the trigger, often shooting near but not touching the victims. And this leads to immense psychological trauma as the victim literally counts his last breath that yes, now I am just going to die. This will continue in the immediate aftermath, and the victim may feel that it is a planned rehearsal and there is a real possibility of the execution in the future. Then another method of psychological torture is the near asphyxiation. The most common way of inducing asphyxia to near death is called submarino. Here, the head is immersed in water for minutes at a time to the point of drowning, then brought out and immersed again. Sometimes the victim may be suspended, head down, and with the help of a rope and pulley, the same act is executed. To further cause psychological distress, the water bath might be contaminated with sewage and fecal matter. In another method called dry submarino, a plastic bag is inserted to the head and tightened in the neck, stopping the air supply to the nostrils, creating near asphyxiation. Another infamous method called waterboarding, which has its history back to the Middle Ages and recently practiced by the US also in the aftermath of 9/11. The victims are strapped to a board or made to lie in a supine position with their heads lower than the rest of their bodies, their faces covered with cloth, and the water is poured over their mouth to create this sensation of drowning. Then the sensory bombardment, the use of very powerful light and loud music, this may lead to mental distress and disorientation. Then the use of animals. Sometimes victims might be threatened with impending attacks by ferocious animals like dogs. In some part of the world, snakes, spiders, scorpion, they are used to instill fear in the mind of the victims. Then the last category of the torture or the types of torture is the pharmacological torture. That means with the help of medications, various preparations. Here, various psychotropic or other chemicals, they are used to induce pain and agony. Likewise, the victim is forcibly injected with addictive drugs, so much so that he becomes addicted to it only to be denied to the drug and forced to go through withdrawal symptoms. Unless they comply with the demand of the torturer, drug will not be given to them. Strong acids, alkalis, they are used to cause burns also in these methods of torture. To summarize the topic of custodial torture, it has been practiced throughout the world. The ancient Indians, Romans, Egyptians and all cultures in the history, they included torture as an integral part of their system. The broadly use of torture was justified for solving crimes as a tool of interrogation, to maintain social control, to defend the ruling state from internal and external threats, to force confessions, for ethnic cleansing or for extortion. Custodial deaths occur in the custody or control of the party, not just limited to the interrogation room, lockup or prison. It may be executed in unofficial secret locations. State actors like police, prison, military, including their intelligence wing, as well as non-state actors like criminal syndicates, the terrorists, the Maoists, the militias and insurgents, they all could be the perpetrators. And at times, role of health professionals being passively involved cannot be ruled out.